Welcome to Bach in the Bedroom, Episode 1. Today I want to talk about the Bach C major fugue for solo violin. I think we tend to think of Bach as this elevated, transcendental composer whose works are really like the epitome of German absolute instrumental music. What I want to show by looking at David Ledbetter's analysis of this fugue is the way in which Bach's writing is actually really grounded in some very basic materials for composition and improvisation in his time. So I want to look at a couple of different examples that are in two categories. The first is schematic counterpoints from the French and German organ traditions, bits of polyphony that come out of traditions of improvising and composing on the keyboard and the organ. The second is partimenti, which are again familiar schematic bits of figured bass from the Italian pedagogical tradition. We can begin by looking at the subject of Bach's C major fugue. So, as we can see with these red circles, the subject is organized around the basic pattern of a descending fourth, rising third. Against this subject, Bach puts a counter subject, which is a descending chromatic scale. And together it sounds like this. The first example here that is taken from the Long Notes manuscript, which was a collection of partimento exercises that is attributed to Bach, although the authorship is unclear and disputed. Bach would definitely have been familiar with these materials. So as we can see in this example taken from the 25th fugue, Bach's subject basically appears almost exactly. So the red circles highlight the ascending third, falling fourth pattern. Again filled in. And counterpointed against a descending chromatic scale. Together. In the first part of this example, we are presented with the subject and counter subject in inversion. So rather than a rising third, falling fourth, we have in the top line a falling third, rising fourth, with passing notes, and counterpointed against an ascending chromatic scale. Altogether sounding. Not only does this appear in the Long Notes manuscript, Ledbetter also shows us that there are examples of this in Johann Pachelbel's work. In this example, we see in the bottom line basically the same pattern, the rising third, falling fourth of Bach's subject. Again, counterpointed against a descending chromatic line. In the top line, kind of offset against the subject in the bottom line, we have again this rising third, falling fourth sequence. So Pachelbel takes these two lines and puts them in three voices. As we saw in the Long Notes example, the subject and counter subject appear in inversion. Bach does the same thing in his fugue. About halfway through, he has an riverso section where every everything happens inverted. So this example is taken from that section, where again we have the rising fourth, falling third of the subject against the ascending chromatic scale. In the next example, we see the way in which Bach, similarly to Pachelbel, takes these two lines and puts them into 3 and 4 different voices. Here in the second voice, on the A string, we have the subject, and on the E string, which is the top voice, we have the counter subject inverted. And then in the third voice, on the D string, in the beginning of this example, there is again the counter subject inverted. And in the lowest voice, on both the G string and the D string, we again have the inverted subject in its most basic form. So in 3 and 4 voices, maybe the most innovative aspect of Bach's fugue here is that he's taking these very basic and familiar materials and turning them into a very expansive movement that is incredibly virtuosic in how it puts 3 and 4 voices over the instrument of the solo violin. That being said, as David Ledbetter shows us, the materials are quite basic and would have been very familiar, definitely formulaic for Bach. And beyond this, he's also using a lot of techniques developed by Italian violinists like Corelli and Tartini and Geminiani to put different voices on different strings of the instrument. Why do we think of Bach's music as in some way transcendental? There's a long tradition of thinking about Bach's music in this way, which of course picks up on the fact that Bach himself was writing this music in the Lutheran Christian tradition. The very famous violinist pedagogue Leopold Auer, who taught among other people Jascha Heifetz, writes about Bach's music. It has been said and truly that these sonatas, notably in the movements in polyphonic style, represent the victory of the spirit over material limitations. So there's this idea that Bach's music transcends individual instruments, transcends the violin, transcends the body of the player even. And Leopold Auer studied with Joseph Joachim, who was a pivotal figure in the Bach revival of the 19th century. And Joachim talked a lot about the idea of the German spirit being the content of the music of people like Bach and Beethoven and Brahms. And not only that, musicologists like Christoph Wolff refer to Bach's music as the seed for absolute musical thinking of the German instrumental tradition. So we can see the ways in which, in both musicology and performance, there is this enduring hold of Christian ideology on our interpretations of Bach's Polyphony, which are, of course, influenced by Bach's own religiosity, but have this kind of hold on our present imagination. The thing I really appreciate about David Ledbetter's scholarship is the ways in which he shows and reminds us that actually Bach's music, rather than transcending the body and the instrument, are really born out of material histories and material techniques developed by people before him and in his time.